Yeah, one of the reasons Omega Man turned out the way it did was because Charlton Heston didn't realize there had been an earlier version. He had read the book, he loved the book, and he talked to director Sam Peckinpah, who was a friend of his, about making a faithful adaptation of I Am Legend. And that was there. So they took it, I think, to Warner Brothers. And they took it to Warner Brothers. And somebody said like, well, how is this going to differ from the Vincent Price version? And Heston was like, what do you mean?
What?
He arranged for a screening, and they watched the Vincent Price version, and they realized that was only a few years before. You're not even talking of a difference of 10 years at this point. So they realized they had to distance themselves from what they did. And then they lost Sam Peckinpah, which I think is an immense loss. Although Boris Segal was a wonderful director. But they came up with a vision, and they really did feel like they needed to distance themselves from what Last Man on Earth was. So there were reasons kind of for the things turning out the way they did. But but I think your point is sound. I think, in all things, the book is triumphant. And that's a wonderful thing about horror fans. I've always, noticed that as opposed to other genres, horror fans, not all, but many of them will give a chance to something, from previous generations and decades. If somebody say, well, you ever read I Am Legend? Oh, you got to read I Am Legend. They may do that. They may give it a try. It's like horror it's a little bit more in touch with its roots. And
I would agree with that for sure.
And I think that's one of the wonderful things about it is that, it's possible to be a horror fan of things today. And people will actually sometimes shame you into saying, you've never seen Christopher Lee's Dracula. Are you kidding? You've never seen Body Snatchers?
You're not a real horror fan.
Yeah, people actually get shamed and pushed into seeing things that, they might not otherwise. All the way back to silent.
I'm laughing, but it's so true, and sometimes it's frustrating, but it's the comedic portion of...
One of the wonderful things about the genre is that that doesn't tend to happen in other forms, and even in music and things like that, where, you would have never said, well, I'm a fan of this and not known. Horror fans are almost like, art fans, where you're like, well, if you're an art fan, if you're great art, it would be unthinkable that you wouldn't know the history of the art form and the history of the art form. And that you're like, well, this takes you back to Rembrandt, or this takes you back to Van Gogh, or whatever. We, in the horror realm, there's still, an appreciation, and we're still reading the grand masters from the 19th century. We're still reading Shelley and Poe and Stoker and Stevenson, and the guys who sort of, brought this storytelling form into the modern era. We're still reading them, and we're still acknowledge their influence and their presence. And Richard is kind of one of the middle guys there. He's sort of like, in that group that's standing there between those people who brought horror into the modern era in the 19th century, and then what's going to happen at the end of the 20th century with Stephen King and Anne Rice and all of the people who turned horror into bestsellers. That it's a common thing to find on the bestseller list, or it's a common thing to find as a blockbuster film at a theater, or a top-rated one of the most talked about TV show of all time. That's why he's so incredibly influential, is that standing between those, he influenced almost everything going forward.
Including his own influencers.
Yes, right, exactly.